Okay, we're going to assemble some bowls, and you know, all this stuff is pretty much A and B, but it's the little details that kill you. The first thing we're going to do is just drop our, you know, the float's got a dampener spring on it, keep it from flopping around in the bowl. It goes over the pivot. And basically that's it, you know, just like a dampener spring in there. And there's a little little E-clip that retains it. You see how many times I can drop it. And you make sure those things are seated. You don't want that thing popping off on you. You know, then the bowl will work off. Okay, one of the things you have to do is this has an O-ring in it, your needle and seat assembly. You gotta lube this stuff because you're putting it into a dry bowl. I use dielectric grease. I lube the O-ring up. I'll take my WD and I'll just squirt it in this hole. That lubricates the thread and the sleeve that it slides in. But you know, it's just going to screw down in there. These are adjusting nuts. So the farther you screw it down, the lower the float level. And so I'm going to eyeball it, because this does have a sight plug on it, just to where I think about where it's going to be. Next important thing when you're doing these is these little gaskets, you know, that seal the nut and the lock screw. You've got to lube them, because you remember you got turning force on a gasket, and if it's dry, the nut's going to want to bind up on it and tear it. And the same way for the screw for the top one. You lube those up with some juice, some dielectric grease, and when you make that adjustment and you tighten these up so it doesn't leak, all you got to do is just snug it. If you got to start cranking on this thing, you got a bad gasket. And even if the carb has been sitting for a long time and you want to adjust these float levels, you need to take the screw completely out. It's better if you got brand new gaskets to put in there. If not, separate it, lube the gaskets, and put it back on and do your adjustment. And that's basically it on the assembly of the fuel bowls and the float. Like I say, I like to do little sub-assemblies. I'll do this one. I'll do the front bowl. The front bowl's the same thing, other than you got the accelerator pump system on here. And when you do that, you want to make sure that that check ball in there is clean and free, moves around. Because when the accelerator pump pushes fuel, it goes through this orifice, through the metering block to the squirters, and it pushes this ball up against the seat and seals you from pushing fuel back into the fuel bowl. And then when the pump relaxes, the fuel ball falls off and fuel is allowed to fill up the accelerator pump chamber. So that's kind of, you know, got to make sure that's really clean. You don't have to take this out of here. Just, you know, get in there with carburetor cleaner or whatever, clean it all really good, and make sure it's nice and clean. Okay, we're going to go over and explain the circuits. You know, if you guys use like paper clips and wires, you know, I clip wires off of stranded, you know, house wiring, you know, 12, 14 gauge, double aught, all different size wires you can make out of you know, stripping wires. That's to go through all your passages. So what we'll start out with first is this is that's a secondary block. This is the main metering block for the front of the car. And what we'll do is start out with the system here. You'll look over here and you'll see this dog leg on here. Now this particular carburetor, this would be for what they call ported vacuum. And actually the hole here goes here, and there's just a fitting that blocks it off because they're not using ported vacuum, and it doesn't even have the provision for the ported vacuum. If it did, what it would do is travel, it goes on like this, so it would be traveling down to this hole here, which in turn is a hole that corresponds to it right here in the base. Now if this had ported vacuum, the base plate would have like an elongated slot right above here, corresponding to this, to the hole that would go in here. See, this one's just going straight through, but it doesn't have a ported vacuum provision. Ported vacuum means you don't pull vacuum until the throttle blades get to a certain point, opening point, then it'll apply vacuum. Usually that's for like distributors for vacuum advanced, because you don't want full manifold vacuum, you want ported vacuum on there. The second system would be the idle and transition slot off idle system. If you look, this port here and this straight port here, they're connected. And this port here is, you know, there's fuel in this fuel well. You know, from this, that whole fuel well's full of fuel. And what it's going to do is pull fuel from the fuel well up. And you actually see it's got this channel here that dances it over to this port here, which in turn pulls the fuel down, and it goes into the transition slot, and it's also drilled. I don't know if I can see the wire, but you can pass this wire and you see the wire goes all the way through both slots. This is your idle circuit port. And this is the screw that goes in here, the tapered screw, which restricts how much fuel is going to flow through that idle port in the base. Which is these holes here that corresponds to it. Because it comes out the bottom here, transition, idle. So what they do is they restrict the amount of, they do it in a couple different ways. They restrict the amount of fuel that's actually going to come out of this port by this plug up here. Usually they'll have like like something with a smaller hole that's underneath here, driven in the cap. It usually this is all like one assembly, and it's an orifice sized hole, because this one has just a very large hole down here, so I'm figuring they have it restricted in their cap up here. Some of them, they restrict it, they put a restrictor down here, and this is just capped off at the top, and that's where the idle fuel will be restricted on how much idle fuel you can pull. They also, this idle off idle system is tied to an air bleed here, which corresponds to the top of here. And what that's doing is, like when you're pulling the vacuum, you're pulling the fuel down this channel, you're also pulling air with it. And that emulsifies the fuel, gives it the aerosol spray can effect. You can always mess around with, like, if you think you need more idle fuel while this car's running, you can take small wires and hang them and drop them in that orifice and see if your idle starts improving, and then you could actually put some JB weld in here, and then measure this hole size, and then just re-drill it a little bit smaller to restrict it. Just some tricks and stuff. The main system which is here, this big hole, pulls fuel. You know, the fuel level rises up in here, and this corresponds to your this big hole here, which corresponds to the nozzles. That's where your main fuel is going to come out of. And this also has an air bleed incorporated. This one here corresponds to this one here, and it does the same purpose. It pulls air into the system from up in this area, and then emulsifies the fuel as it comes out the main metering nozzle. The other circuit here is the power valve circuit. Power valve is closed under normal vacuum conditions. They're rated at inches of mercury. Pretty much the standard ones on here are 6.5 inches of mercury, which means that the power valve will not open until the manifold vacuum gets to 6.5 and below. And the way the power valve works, it screws in from this side here. I'll just screw it down. And there's a gasket under it. Same thing on that gasket. You want to lube that gasket up so when you tighten this. Now this power valve is sitting in this vacuum chamber because there's vacuum being pulled through this hole. Manifold vacuum goes straight through the base plate. So what happens is when the car is idling, you got high vacuum, this power valve closes. And what it does is when you fall below that vacuum range at 6.5 inches of mercury, this power valve will open, and it'll allow more fuel to come from the main bowl through here, through these slots corresponding to these holes. And what that's doing is it's enriching the system, because you got jets down here that are metering everything coming in from the bowl, and this is going to just allow extra fuel for you know, like wide open power conditions. That's pretty much on the thing, and that's where I keep telling you guys that these surfaces have to be dead flat. Camera cuts out after a certain time, but that's where I was talking about why these surfaces have to be dead flat. And the warp in the metering block, you got to get this metering block flat, because this all has to seal. You know, this all has to seal that vacuum area. And if it's not flat, you're going to be pulling fuel into this vacuum area from your main, and the main could be pulling from the idle circuit, and you got all kinds of problem. You could be pulling fuel from the accelerator pump system, because this is the accelerator pump system. Comes in at this hole here from the bowl where the pump is, pumps it in, comes up, goes through this hole, goes through that hole, and comes out your squirter nozzles here. But like I say, if this is not flat, you could be pulling fuel from this area also into your vacuum chamber and into the engine. It's, you know, called unmetered fuel. You'll have all kinds of erratic idle performance, off idle problems when these are not flat. That's why we mill them and we straighten out the metering blocks. We want to get 100% seal, so none of that's leaking. We'll take a look at the secondary. Now, a lot of vacuum secondary cars just use the metering plate and not a block, but this particular carburetor uses the block. If you notice, this block does not have a power valve in it. It does not have the idle air fuel mixer screws. Nothing's drilled, and this port is actually, what I was telling you on that idle circuit, is blocked. It's not tied. It's not tied to the channel for the idle off idle system. Only the off idle system is operational on these on the secondary. That's why there was that long slot in the base plate, so they could take idle fuel from the front and bring it to the back. Same thing on this. Even though this doesn't have a power valve in here, it still has a port, a vacuum port here that's pulling vacuum in this area, even though it's not doing anything. You want this all sealed, otherwise it's gonna want to pull vacuum and get unmetered fuel coming through the back end. Okay, we're back on. We're going to assemble the bowl and the metering block on the main body. You have to deal with the fan noise. It's I'm in Arizona here, and it's really stoking up, so you got to have the fan on. Okay, so what I've done is primary metering block, power valve in, greased the gasket underneath, installed the jets. Put the gaskets on. I put my idle screws in with the little cork, and I adjust these at 1 1/4 turn out. That's usually a pretty good initial adjustment. And I put the little gaskets under all the screws. I've lubed them also. So what we'll do is and then also what I do on all carburetors I work on is I chase all the threaded holes. That, you know, because after you bead blast them and stuff, they kind of get kind of rough. It makes assembly a whole lot easier. So I chase all the holes with a tap. So basically what we're going to do is, now normally I install the base plate and then I do the bowls, but I'm going to do it this way because, so if you guys are checking, when I show you how to check for vacuum leaks in your power valve, you can check it here with the base plate off. You can check it with the base plate on to see where you're leaking from. Are you leaking from the chamber, or because this is so badly warped down here, it's leaking in this area around here. So we'll throw it on. I've installed the accelerator pump. These older style ones use clutch head screws. I think they use these up to like 69, and they went to a different style. And I've sprayed a little WD-40 on all my threads on the screws. And a lot of guys booger these threads up because they use the wrong size screwdriver. This screwdriver here is a little bit small, but I have a wider one when I actually start to put some pressure on them. I just use this to drive them down. And you want to torque these real evenly. You know, the crisscross, you know, pattern. This is just a screwdriver I ground out and made for this, and it works on other applications. You want to take them down till you got those gaskets compressed really well. It's kind of a feel thing. You just keep going back and forth, snugging. After this sits for a while, I'll even go back and check the torque on them because the gasket will compress. So we're basically just getting it goot and tight. So what we're going to do next is we're going to perform our vacuum test. Okay, so basically our little setup here is I had to put a screw with some sealer on it because that threaded hole goes all the way to the vacuum chamber, and without the base plate on and it's screwed in, I always put sealer on there so I can vacuum check it. I just did it this way just to show you guys. And basically, I put a little grease around my tit. They look like this. They come with the Mighty Vac sets just to seal the hole good. And what we're going to do is pull a vacuum in that chamber. Make sure you guys can see it. See, I'm at 20 inches of vacuum. Now, if you guys do this and you start seeing it start to creep off slightly, you know, slowly creeping, it's probably fine. Sometimes these things are hard to get 100% sealed, but when they're really screwed up is when you're pulling vacuum and the needle jumps, it keeps going back down. You got a dead leak from your metering system right into that chamber. If you're starting to get a little creep back, try snugging the screws some more. But usually if you can pull up to 20 inches and it starts just barely easing off, it's a good system. I would say it's good to go. Like I say, I'm just showing you this way is a way if you take a carburetor off a car and you want to test it, you can test it with the base plate on, and it's got a vacuum leak, as you can't pull vacuum. You can pull the base plate off and put that screw in to seal it, and then try. What I'm saying is you can eliminate, is it the base plate leaking, or is it the gasket surface in here not being flat leaking, just to eliminate that. Okay, I put the rear bowl on, same setup. This screw hole does not penetrate into the vacuum chamber area, so I don't need to put a screw with the sealer on it. This one I can just go right at it. We can pull up a vacuum. It stays, holds. So we know we're sealed. We're not pulling any vacuum, any leaks, you know, in that area. So the next thing we're going to do is fit up our, you know, they give you a couple different base plate gaskets. Don't take for granted the one that you took off was the right one. This carburetor does not use this vacuum, you know, ported vacuum slot. It doesn't correspond into the base plate of the carb. But even though it still will give you some holes for it. Got to make sure that all of our holes correspond. And this looks good. Like I say, just don't take for granted the one you took off. You know, somebody rebuilt it and used the wrong base plate. You go by the bore size. You notice that one I put on there before is a little bit larger bore. The other gasket's a smaller bore. She just has a lot more, you know, fits probably different applications for ported vacuum. You see it lines up with that hole. Everything looks good. Idle, off idle circuits, holes, vacuum chamber holes, everything's good. So we're going to call this good, and we're going to use this gasket. We install the base plate. Like I say, normally I put the base plate on first, but that's showing you guys that vacuum check. Just make sure your arm is underneath here when you put it on, otherwise you're going to be hating life taking that arm back off, because it'll be bound up. And just get your gasket all lined up, and basically, you know, they've got 8 screw holes, but they only use these outer ones. They're too cheap to throw 2 more screws in. I usually throw extra screws in there, but I'm out of these right now, and I've been trying to find a source on them because they're 1224 Phillips screws. I can get the standard ones. I should probably just use the standards. Like, who sees anything under the base plate? But I'm going to go ahead and torque this base down, and then we'll continue on. Okay, I've installed the base plate, torqued it down. I'm just going to double check my vacuum source to make sure that the base plate is sealing. We know we had a good seal at the metering block in the body, so we'll just pull a vacuum. And it's holding vacuum. We can check the front, the back. Like I say, you can put a little grease on that fitting. Sometimes the little titty might start leaking. Just to make sure you got a good seal on it. And our rear's holding. So we're good to go. Like I say, this is just a Mighty Vac pump. You can buy them anywhere. I think they're somewhere around 30 bucks or something to give you all the little fittings. The tool has a lot of other uses besides that. I did put sealer on this threaded hole here that penetrated into the vacuum chamber, because I only want the vacuum pulling here. I don't want it coming around the threads, or if I had to go back and check to make sure this was sealed good, I know I wouldn't be leaking vacuum with my tester from here. Okay, I've got the base plate all assembled on there. Got my transition tube, brings the fuel from the front to the rear. There's an O-ring in there. You want to grease them up with dielectric grease, put them in the bowl. You put them in the one bowl you got mounted, usually the front. Your O-ring's in the bowl on here, and you put the tube in and then push it on. It's a good thing you want to lube the ends of those tubes and make sure there's no sharp burrs right on the edge, because they're going to slide through the O-ring and you don't want to be cutting the O-ring. I put the vacuum, this was a manifold vacuum plug that was in there, and I also plugged up the ported vacuum hole here. Even though the ported vacuum does not go down to the base plate, it was in there, so I put it back. One other adjustment on here that's kind of overlooked is, if you notice, there's a screw down here, and the secondaries are stopping against that screw. Now this screw does one of two things. When I've got my secondaries closed all the way, I want to come up on this screw and just barely push those secondaries just off of their seat slightly. And what that prevents is the plates from binding in the seat, especially when the carburetor gets hot, so it's expanding and contracting, and those butterflies are beveled. They're going to fit really tight in that seat to seal the air, and they can lock up in there. You know, it's a throttle plate bind. So what that screw does is just slightly move them off of that seat, just so they're not seating in the bore tight. You could also use this adjustment, say that you needed some more air and you didn't want to keep cranking your primary open, because you didn't want to get past your too far in your transition slot to where your idle adjustment screws aren't working. You could actually just crack this open a little more and allow air to come in on the secondary throttle blades, because it does have the idle circuit back there that I showed you on the base plate where it transitions. So this is a tuning tool, but initially what you want to do is, its primary purpose is just to keep those secondaries from binding in the bore. So, you know, the way I do it is I back the screw out, and then sometimes you got to heat this up. I took it all apart when I cleaned the base. You got to heat it up with some mat, because they get like crusted in there, rusted. Remove it, clean it all good, run a tap through there, then you reassemble it. And what I did was I closed my throttle blades, and then I just took the screw and just barely came up to where I just moved this slightly, just so that the plates would not bind in the bore. You know, it's the little things like that that kill you on carburetors, and it's not just Holley's, it's all of them. It's the details, the passages being clean, understanding what all these circuits are doing, why they're there, and like I say, cleanliness. Holley's, the big problem with them is this warping issue. Once that's straightened out, these carbs, this carburetor will run better than when it was brand new, because Holley does not surface those areas right out of the factory. They're just come out of their die cast machine, and they're taking it for granted that they're flat enough, and most of the time they're not. So we'll move on. I'm going to assemble the vacuum pod, and we'll get that mounted and go over how we check this operation of the vacuum secondaries.